30,000 feet above Nazi Germany, Staff Sergeant Henry Dobbins watched black smoke pour from engine number 3, while oil sprayed across the cockpit windshield like rain. The B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered violently as engine number 2 began making a grinding noise that every airman dreaded. 8 men aboard, enemy territory below, and the English Channel still 140 miles away. The pilot's voice cracked over the intercom with words that made every crew member's blood run cold. "Prepare to bail out." But Dobbins wasn't listening anymore. His calloused hands, the same hands that once fixed broken threshers with baling wire and prayer back in Iowa, were already moving toward the toolbox. He remembered something his father told him during the dust storms of 1936, something about pressure and flow and making do with what you had. The other crew members thought he'd lost his mind when he started tearing apart a fuel line with nothing but a belt strap, chewing gum from his pocket, and a hose clamp. They had no idea this farmer's son was about to pull off the most unlikely repair in bombing mission history. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of March 14th, 1944, started like any other mission briefing at RAF Ridgewell in Essex, England. Henry Dobbins sat in the crowded Quonset hut among 200 other airmen, his broad shoulders hunched forward as he studied the large map at the front of the room. The target for today's mission was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany, a facility churning out fighter planes that had been tearing holes in Allied bomber formations for months. The intelligence officer's pointer traced the route across the North Sea, over the Frisian Islands, then deep into German territory. Expected enemy resistance, heavy flak, numerous fighter intercepts. Expected casualties, moderate to severe. It was the kind of briefing that made men reach for their lucky charms or write quick letters home before heading to their aircraft. Henry didn't write letters before missions anymore. He'd learned early on that dwelling on the possibility of not coming back only made his hands shake when he needed them steady. Instead, he checked and rechecked his equipment, running through mental lists the way his father used to walk the fence line every morning, looking for weak posts and loose wire. The habits of farm life had followed him from the cornfields of Iowa to the bomber bases of England, and those habits had kept him alive through 17 missions when plenty of other men hadn't made it past 5. At 24 years old, Henry Dobbins was older than most of the enlisted men in his crew. He'd spent 6 years after high school working his father's farm, nursing aging equipment through harvest after harvest with whatever materials he could scrounge. The Great Depression had taught him that new parts were a luxury few could afford, so he'd learned to improvise. A cracked cylinder head could be patched with a mixture of soap and sawdust. A broken fan belt could be replaced with strips of leather cut from old boots. A seized bearing could be coaxed back to life with the right combination of heat, oil, and patience. His father used to say that a good mechanic wasn't someone who had all the right tools, but someone who could make the wrong tools work anyway. Those skills had caught the attention of his drill sergeant during basic training. While other recruits struggled to understand the theoretical mechanics lessons in their technical manuals, Henry simply looked at engines and understood how they breathed, how they moved, how they thought. He could hear problems in the sound of an engine the way some men could identify birds by their songs. A knock in the third cylinder meant carbon buildup. A whistle from the manifold meant a crack near the second mounting bolt. A skip in the rhythm meant a fouled spark plug, always the one furthest from the access panel. The Army Air Forces had wanted to make him an aircraft mechanic, keep him on the ground where his talents could service multiple planes. But Henry had insisted on joining a flight crew. He'd watched too many bombers return shot to pieces, seen too many mechanics try to explain to fresh-faced pilots what might go wrong at 20,000 feet. Henry figured if he was going to keep these machines flying, he needed to understand what they went through up there in the combat zone where theories met reality and reality usually won. So they'd made him a flight engineer and assigned him to Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald's crew, a B-17G Flying Fortress they'd named Prairie Dog in honor of Henry's Iowa roots. The nose art featured a cartoon rodent wearing an aviator's cap and goggles, holding a wrench in one paw and a bomb in the other. Henry had grown to love that airplane the way some men loved their cars or their hunting dogs. He knew every rivet, every patch, every quirk of her 4 Wright Cyclone engines. He knew that engine number 1 ran 30 degrees hotter than the others and needed extra attention on long flights. He knew that engine number 4 had a tendency to flood if you advanced the throttle too quickly after startup. He knew the sound of her hydraulics, the feel of her control cables, the smell of her oil and fuel and metal and canvas. The crew chief on the ground, a gruff master sergeant named Kowalski, sometimes joked that Henry treated the bomber better than most men treated their wives. Henry always replied that the bomber had never complained about his snoring or asked him to take out the trash. which usually got a laugh from the other mechanics. But there was truth beneath the humor. Henry understood that in combat, your aircraft wasn't just transportation, it was shelter, weapon, and lifeline all rolled into one. Treating it right meant it might treat you right when things went wrong, and in bomber combat over Nazi Germany, things went wrong with predictable regularity. The walk to Prairie Dog's hardstand took 15 minutes through the morning mist that hung over the airfield like wet wool. Henry carried his gear bag over one shoulder, his parachute harness already strapped on, his heavy flight suit making him sweat despite the March cold. Around him, crews were performing the same ritual at 50 other hardstands scattered across the base. Pilots walking around their aircraft, checking control surfaces and tires, bombardiers loading their sights and checking the bomb bay, gunners testing their turrets and loading ammunition belts, ground crews making final adjustments, pulling chocks, and wishing the airmen luck with tired smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Prairie Dog sat on her hardstand like a sleeping giant, her olive-drab paint scheme dulled by months of combat missions. Patches covered flak holes in her wings and fuselage, silver squares that marked where German anti-aircraft shells had found their target, and by grace or luck, missed anything vital. Henry counted 23 patches visible from the ground, not including the ones under the belly or inside the airframe. Each patch represented a moment when they could have died but didn't. A split second of fortune in the middle of chaos. Henry climbed through the hatch and made his way to his station between the cockpit and the bomb bay. His position was cramped, surrounded by gauges, valves, and mechanical systems that controlled everything from fuel flow to oxygen distribution. He began his pre-flight checks, methodically working through the list that had become as familiar as a prayer. Fuel shut-off valves, closed. Booster pumps, off. Generator switches, off. Hydraulic pressure, checking normal. Oil pressure, checking normal. He worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, knowing that a single missed step could doom them all hours later when they were too far from home to turn back. Lieutenant Fitzgerald climbed into the left seat of the cockpit and began his own checks. At 22, the pilot was 2 years younger than Henry but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to trust his training and his crew. He and Henry had developed an easy working relationship built on mutual respect. Fitzgerald knew Henry understood the aircraft better than anyone else on the base, and Henry knew Fitzgerald would listen to him when something didn't sound right, even if it contradicted what the gauges said. "How's she looking, Henry?" Fitzgerald's voice came through the intercom, calm and professional. "Everything's checking normal, Lieutenant." Henry replied, his eyes still scanning the instrument panel. "Number one's running hot as usual, but nothing outside limits. I'll keep an eye on it." The co-pilot, Lieutenant James Wheeler, settled into the right seat and began calling out checklist items. Behind them in the nose, Bombardier Harold Pierce was arranging his equipment and charts. Navigator Raymond Kowalski, no relation to the ground crew chief, was already plotting courses on his table. The radio operator, Corporal Anthony Russo, tested his equipment with short transmissions to the tower. In the tail, waist, and ball turret positions, the gunners were loading weapons and checking ammunition feeds. They were 8 men about to fly into hell in a machine made of aluminum and hope, trusting their lives to 4 engines, thousands of parts, and each other. It was the kind of arrangement that sounded insane when you thought about it too much, so most of them had learned not to think about it at all. At 0730 hours, the first aircraft began rolling toward the runway. The mission called for a formation of 36 bombers from the 381st Bomb Group, with fighters providing escort for portions of the flight. Prairie Dog was assigned to the low squadron, middle position, which meant they'd be particularly vulnerable to fighter attacks from below, but would have some protection from the aircraft around them. It was neither the safest nor the most dangerous position in the formation, just another day's calculated risk in a war that dealt in calculated risks every hour of every day. The takeoff was routine. 4 engines roared to life in sequence, each one adding its voice to the thunder that rolled across the airfield. Henry monitored the gauges as Fitzgerald advanced the throttles, watching temperatures and pressures rise to their operational ranges. The bomber accelerated down the runway, heavy with fuel and bombs, reluctant to leave the earth that had made it. Then the tail came up, the rumbling of the wheels smoothed out, and they were climbing into the grey English sky where dozens of other bombers were already circling, waiting to form up into the combat box formation that would carry them to Germany. The assembly took 40 minutes. Bombers circled and maneuvered, tucking into their assigned positions like pieces of a 3-dimensional puzzle. When the formation was complete, they turned east toward the sunrise and the enemy beyond. Henry settled into his routine, monitoring engine performance and fuel consumption, adjusting mixture controls to keep the temperatures balanced, watching for the subtle signs that might indicate developing problems. The English Channel passed beneath them, grey water flecked with white caps. Then the Dutch coast appeared, and they crossed into occupied territory where every person below was either prisoner or enemy. The German fighters found them over the Frisian Islands. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, and Messerschmitt 109 seconds swept through the formation in coordinated attacks, their cannons flashing, their speed and agility making them seem like angry hornets attacking a flight of geese. The bombers' guns answered back, 50-caliber machine guns chattering from every turret, creating a web of tracers through the sky. Henry felt Prairie Dog shudder as one of the waist gunners opened fire. Through the small window beside his station, he caught glimpses of fighters rolling past, impossibly fast, gone before you could really track them. "Fighter, 6 o'clock low," the tail gunner called. Henry heard the distinctive sound of the tail guns firing, felt the empty casings rattle down through the aircraft to collect in bins. A bomber in the formation ahead of them took hits, smoke streaming from an engine. It dropped out of formation, losing altitude, already looking like a dying thing. Henry watched long enough to see parachutes begin to blossom like white flowers around the falling aircraft, then forced himself to look back at his instruments. Watching other crews die wouldn't help him keep his own crew alive. The fighter attacks continued for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Then the German fighters broke off, either low on fuel or ammunition, and the formation flew on into an ominous silence. Henry knew what was coming next. Every briefing had highlighted the flak concentrations around Bremen. The German anti-aircraft batteries had been registered on every approach route, and they were very good at their job. The first bursts appeared ahead of them, black puffs of smoke that bloomed and faded like deadly flowers. Then the formation flew into the flak field and the real hell began. The anti-aircraft shells burst all around them, creating a landscape of smoke and shrapnel through which they had to fly straight and level for the bombing run. The aircraft bucked and shook with near misses. Henry heard metal tearing somewhere in the fuselage, heard someone grunt in pain over the intercom. The bombardier called out corrections, steering the pilot toward the target while Henry's hands gripped the edge of his station, and he tried not to think about how thin aluminum skin really was when you measured it against high-explosive shells. "Bombs away," Pierce's voice came through the intercom, and Prairie Dog lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive fell away toward the factory below. Fitzgerald immediately banked away from the target, no longer constrained by the need to fly straight and level. The formation began to break up slightly as each aircraft turned for home, and Henry felt the first glimmer of relief. The worst was over. They'd hit the target, they were still flying, and now it was just a matter of getting back to England. That was when engine number 3 exploded. The sound was like a shotgun blast inside a steel drum. The aircraft lurched sideways, throwing Henry against the bulkhead. Alarms began screaming, and through his window, Henry saw flames streaming back from the nacelle of the right outboard engine. The propeller was windmilling uselessly, and black smoke was pouring from the cowling. His hands moved automatically, reaching for the engine fire control, pulling the handle that would shut off fuel and activate the fire suppression system. The flames died down but didn't go out completely, and the propeller continued to windmill, creating massive drag on the right side of the aircraft. "Number 3's on fire," Henry called to the cockpit, his voice steady despite the adrenaline dump. Fire suppression activated, attempting to feather the prop. He worked the feathering control, trying to turn the propeller blades edge onto the wind to reduce drag, but the mechanism wouldn't engage. The explosion had damaged something in the hub assembly, and the propeller continued to spin, fighting against their forward motion like an anchor. Fitzgerald and Wheeler were fighting the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level and in formation, but with one engine out and creating drag, Prairie Dog began to fall behind. "We can make it on 3 engines," Fitzgerald said, his voice tight with concentration. "Henry, how's our fuel looking?" Henry checked the gauges, doing rapid calculations in his head. "We're burning more on the right side, trying to compensate for the drag. At this rate, we'll be cutting it close to make the coast." "We'll make it," Fitzgerald said, and Henry wanted to believe him. The formation was pulling away now, leaving them behind. 2 other damaged bombers were also falling back, all of them suddenly vulnerable without the protection of the group. Henry scanned the sky for fighters, knowing that German pilots loved to pick off stragglers. They flew for 20 minutes, losing altitude gradually, the 3 remaining engines straining to keep them aloft. Then engine number 2 began making a grinding noise that Henry recognized immediately. The bearings were failing, probably damaged by vibration from the windmilling propeller on number 3. He watched the oil pressure gauge for number 2 begin to drop, watched the temperature begin to climb. It was the kind of cascade failure that mechanics dreaded. One problem triggering another until the whole system came apart. "Number 2's going bad," Henry called. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. If we don't shut it down soon, it's going to seize. If we shut down number 2, can we make it on 1 and 4? Fitzgerald asked, and Henry heard the stress in the pilot's voice now. Henry looked at the fuel gauges, looked at their altitude, looked at the map coordinates and did the math. 2 engines on the left side, none on the right. The asymmetric thrust would make the aircraft almost impossible to control. They'd spiral into the ground or have to bail out over occupied territory. Either way, they wouldn't make it home. Negative, Henry said quietly. We'd never keep it level, but if we keep running number 2, it's going to grenade and probably take out engine 1 with it. There was silence on the intercom while everyone processed what that meant. Fitzgerald finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. All right, all crew, prepare to bail out. We'll try to make it another 10 minutes toward the coast. Give you all a better chance of making it to friendly territory. Henry heard acknowledgements from the crew members, heard the waist gunners removing their turrets, heard the ball turret gunner rotating his position to exit. He looked out at the landscape below, saw the patchwork of fields and forests, saw the thin line of the coast in the distance. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the engines held, but they weren't going to make it to England. After 17 missions, after all the close calls and lucky breaks, this was where it ended. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his parachute. That's when he saw the fuel lines running along the bulkhead beside his station, saw the pressure gauges, saw the system that fed fuel from the tanks to the engines, and something his father had done during the summer of 1936 came back to him with perfect clarity. It had been one of the worst years of the Dust Bowl. The crops were failing, the soil was blowing away, and the ancient tractor that powered their irrigation pump had thrown a rod right in the middle of July. They couldn't afford a new engine, couldn't even afford rebuilt parts. But the well pump had to run or they'd lose everything. Henry's father had stared at that broken tractor for 2 days. Then he'd done something that seemed crazy at the time. He'd taken the pressure system from their broken thresher, combined it with the fuel pump from an abandoned truck, connected everything with garden hose and pipe clamps, and somehow made it work. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't by the book, and it shouldn't have functioned at all. But it had kept that pump running for 3 months until they could afford proper repairs. Henry stared at the fuel system in front of him and saw the same principle. Different machines, same basic problem. They needed to shut down number 2 before it destroyed itself and took number 1 with it. But they also needed power from that engine to maintain control. What if he could somehow balance the fuel flow, reduce the strain on the failing bearings while keeping partial power? It would require rerouting fuel pressure, bypassing the damaged components, creating a makeshift system that no engineer would ever approve. But his father's impossible fix had worked. Maybe this one could too. Lieutenant, give me 5 minutes before you give the bailout order, Henry said suddenly. Henry, we don't have 5 minutes to spare, Fitzgerald replied. I know, but I think I can fix this. Give me 5 minutes. If it doesn't work, we'll bail out then. There was a pause. Then Fitzgerald said, 5 minutes. Make it count. Henry's hands stopped shaking. He pulled off his parachute harness and grabbed his toolbox, his mind already racing through the steps. First, he needed to reduce fuel flow to engine 2 without shutting it down completely. He found the manual bypass valve, normally only used during maintenance, and partially closed it. The engine's power output dropped, but it continued running, and the temperature stopped climbing. That bought him time, but didn't solve the underlying problem. Next, he needed to balance the pressure across the entire fuel system to reduce the strain on engine 2's damaged components. The B-17's fuel system was designed with redundancy, with multiple crossfeed valves that allowed fuel from any tank to feed any engine. Henry started opening valves that were normally left closed, creating new flow paths. He grabbed a fuel pressure gauge from his emergency equipment kit and tapped into one of the lines, watching the readings fluctuate. The grinding noise from engine 2 changed pitch, became slightly less pronounced. The bearing was still failing, but not as quickly. He was buying time, but it wasn't enough. At this reduced power setting, they still couldn't maintain altitude. They were descending at 300 feet per minute, and the ground was getting closer with every passing second. Henry looked at the fuel lines again, tracing them with his eyes, following the logic of the system. The problem was that even with reduced fuel flow, the damaged bearings in engine 2 were still carrying the full rotational load of the propeller. What he needed was to reduce that load, but the propeller couldn't be feathered. Unless he could somehow create uneven thrust within the engine itself, make it run rough enough to reduce the propeller's efficiency, decrease the bearing load without shutting down the power output entirely. It was the kind of solution that would make any trained engineer cringe. Deliberately making an engine run poorly was against every principle of proper maintenance. But his father's farm had run on deliberately unbalanced systems for years, mismatched belt drives, offset gears, pumps that wobbled and clattered but somehow kept working. Sometimes the right solution wasn't the elegant one, sometimes it was just the one that worked. Henry grabbed a fuel line wrench and started loosening the connection on one of the fuel injectors for engine 2. The fitting was tight, hadn't been touched since the factory installed it. He braced himself against the aircraft's vibration and put his whole body into turning the wrench. The fitting finally broke loose. Fuel mist sprayed briefly until he could control the flow with his thumb. Now he had direct access to one of the engine cylinders. From his pocket, he pulled out a stick of gum he'd been saving for after the mission. He chewed it quickly, working it into a pliable mass, then used it to partially plug the fuel line opening. It was insane. It violated every safety protocol ever written, but it would create uneven fuel distribution to the cylinders, make the engine run roughly, reduce the load on the bearings while maintaining partial power output. He needed something to secure the gum in place and to clamp down the loosened fitting without completely tightening it. His belt. Henry pulled the leather belt from his waist and cut a strip from it with his pocket knife. He wrapped the leather around the fuel line fitting, pulled it tight, then secured it with a hose clamp from his toolbox. The arrangement looked like something a child might build with random parts, but when Henry carefully opened the fuel valve, Engine 2's note changed to a rough cough while still producing thrust. "What did you just do?" Fitzgerald called back. "Number 2 sounds terrible." "It's supposed to sound terrible," Henry replied, watching the gauges. "The bearing's still bad, but I reduced the load on it. We're getting about 60% power output with maybe 30% of the stress on the damaged components." "That's not possible," Wheeler said. "I know," Henry agreed, "but it's working." And it was. Engine 2 was running in a deliberately unbalanced state, coughing and sputtering, but producing enough thrust to help keep them level. The temperature had stopped rising. The oil pressure had stabilized at a lower but sustainable level. The grinding noise was still there, but no longer increasing in intensity. It was the mechanical equivalent of a wounded man limping on a broken leg, knowing he couldn't run but refusing to fall. Henry monitored the fuel pressure across all 4 engines, making small adjustments to the crossfeed valves, balancing the system like a juggler keeping multiple balls in the air. His makeshift repair had bought them time, but the real question was whether it would hold long enough to reach England. "Henry, I don't know what you did, but we're maintaining altitude," Fitzgerald said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "How long will this hold?" "I honestly don't know, Lieutenant," Henry replied. "Could be 5 minutes, could be 5 hours, but it's what we've got." "Then we're going for the coast," Fitzgerald decided. "All crew, disregard bailout preparation. We're taking this bird home." The next hour was the longest of Henry's life. He stood at his station, one hand on the fuel valve controls, the other on the pressure gauges, making constant tiny adjustments to keep the system balanced. Engine 2 continued its rough coughing rhythm, and every minute that it kept running felt like a small miracle. Engine 3's windmilling propeller continued to create drag, and the flames had reignited slightly despite the fire suppression, but they weren't spreading. Engines 1 and 4 were running hot from the extra load but staying within operational limits. The Dutch coast appeared ahead of them, and then they were over the North Sea. The water looked grey and cold and absolutely beautiful because it meant they'd made it out of occupied territory. If they had to ditch now or bail out, they at least had a chance of being picked up by Allied rescue vessels instead of becoming prisoners of war. "Navigator, give me a heading for the closest airfield," Fitzgerald ordered. "Come right to heading 265, Raymond called back. "That'll take us to RAF Woodbridge. It's an emergency landing field, extra long runway." Fitzgerald brought Prairie Dog around to the new heading, fighting the controls as the asymmetric thrust tried to push them into a spiral. Henry could see the pilot and co-pilot, both straining against the yokes, muscles standing out on their necks with the effort of keeping the bomber level. This wasn't flying anymore. This was wrestling with a wounded giant that wanted to fall from the sky. The English coast appeared after another 40 minutes. Green fields and grey villages that looked like paradise after the hostile landscape they'd left behind. Henry's arms were aching from maintaining constant pressure on the fuel controls, and sweat was running down his face despite the cold at altitude. But Engine 2 was still running, still producing thrust, still holding together despite the damage that should have destroyed it 20 minutes after it started. "Woodbridge ahead," the navigator called. 10 miles. "I see it," Fitzgerald replied. "Henry, I'm going to need everything these engines can give me for the landing. Can you do that?" Henry looked at his makeshift repair, at the leather belt strap wrapped around the fuel line, at the chewing gum that was somehow keeping uneven pressure in the system, at the collection of jury-rigged solutions that was holding their lives together. "Yeah," he said, I can do that. The landing gear came down with a thunk and a groan of hydraulics. The flaps extended, increasing drag but giving them more control at low speed. Prairie Dog lined up with the runway at Woodbridge, a strip of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from the air. They came in steep, engines roaring, the whole aircraft shaking with the effort of staying aloft. The runway rushed up to meet them, and then the wheels hit with a screech of rubber on concrete. Fitzgerald stood on the brakes, and Henry could smell burning rubber as they decelerated. The runway flashed past, white-painted lines blurring together. For a terrifying moment, Henry thought they were going to run out of concrete, see the end of the runway rushing toward them without enough space to stop. But then the bomber's speed bled away to nothing, and Fitzgerald brought them to a halt with 50 yards of runway remaining. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The engines continued to run, still turning, still functioning despite everything. Then Fitzgerald reached up and began shutting them down one by one. The sudden silence after hours of engine noise was deafening. Henry could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the tick of cooling metal, could hear someone in the back of the aircraft laughing with relief or hysteria, or both. "Everyone okay back there?" Fitzgerald called. The acknowledgements came back one by one. A few minor injuries from shrapnel during the flak barrage, but everyone was alive and functional. 8 men who should have been parachuting into enemy territory or dead in a crashed bomber, and instead, they were safe on an English airfield because a farmer's son had remembered how his father fixed a broken tractor 18 years ago. The ground crew at Woodbridge surrounded Prairie Dog as the crew climbed out, their faces showing a mixture of professional concern and open amazement. The crew chief, a weathered sergeant with grey in his hair, walked around the aircraft making notes, pausing at each damaged engine, shaking his head in disbelief. "Sir," he said to Fitzgerald, "I've been maintaining aircraft for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Number 3's engine mount is cracked, the cowling's half burned through, and the propeller hub assembly is destroyed. Number 2 has a seized bearing, the oil pump is gone, and somehow you kept it running anyway. How the hell did you get this thing home?" Fitzgerald jerked his thumb back toward Henry. "Ask my flight engineer. He's the one who worked the magic." The crew chief approached Henry, who was sitting on the ground with his back against the landing gear, too tired to stand. "What did you do exactly, Sergeant?" Henry tried to explain about the fuel pressure rerouting, about the partial blockage to create uneven cylinder loading, about using a belt strap and chewing gum to hold it all together. The crew chief's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to outright disbelief. "That shouldn't work," the crew chief finally said. "That violates about 15 different technical orders. The fuel pressure alone should have caused a fire or a complete failure." "I know," Henry said, "but it did work, at least long enough." Within an hour, word of the makeshift repair had spread through the airfield. Mechanics gathered around Prairie Dog's engines, examining Henry's jury-rigged fuel system, taking photographs, making sketches. A major from the engineering section showed up and spent 30 minutes interrogating Henry about every detail of what he'd done. By evening, a full-bird colonel from 8th Air Force headquarters was standing in the maintenance hangar, looking at the disassembled components like an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. "Sergeant Dobbins," the colonel said, "I need to understand something. You had no training in advanced engine repair, correct?" "No, sir," Henry replied. "Just basic flight engineer school." "Then where did you learn to do this?" Henry thought about his father standing in a dusty Iowa field, staring at a broken tractor with the same intensity other men might give to a chess problem. He thought about lessons learned through necessity during the Depression, when replacement parts were luxuries and improvisation was survival. He thought about harvest seasons saved by baling wire and hope, by solutions that shouldn't work but somehow did. "My father's farm, sir," Henry said simply. "We couldn't afford to let things stay broken." The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "The preliminary engineering report says your repair shouldn't have functioned for more than a few minutes. The fuel pressure ratios were all wrong. The uneven cylinder loading should have destroyed the engine completely, and using chewing gum as a sealant in a high-pressure fuel system is." He paused, searching for words. "Well, it's insane. But you kept that engine running for over an hour and brought your entire crew home alive. That's the kind of insane we can use." Over the following weeks, engineering teams studied Henry's makeshift system. They couldn't officially recommend it, couldn't include it in any technical manual, because it violated too many safety protocols and relied on variables that couldn't be standardized. But they acknowledged that in certain specific circumstances, with the right combination of damage and available resources, a similar approach might save other crews. More importantly, They began including more comprehensive improvisation scenarios in flight engineer training. Not every problem had a by-the-book solution, and sometimes the difference between survival and death was a mechanic who understood principles well enough to break the rules effectively. Henry and his crew returned to their regular base 3 days later. Prairie Dog was deemed beyond economical repair and was eventually scrapped for parts. The crew was assigned a new aircraft, a fresh B-17 straight from the factory that they named Prairie Dog 2. It didn't have the same character as their original bomber, didn't have the patches and scars that told stories of survival, but it had something better, 4 engines that worked the way they were supposed to. Henry flew 16 more missions before the war in Europe ended. He never had to attempt another field repair like the one over the North Sea, which suited him fine. But the story of his impossible fix spread through the bomber groups, became one of those legends that crews told each other in the barracks on nights before difficult missions. It was proof that even when everything went wrong, even when the situation seemed hopeless, there might still be a way through if you were clever enough and desperate enough to find it. After the war, Henry returned to Iowa and took over his father's farm. The land had recovered from the Dust Bowl years, and modern farming was beginning to transform agriculture with new equipment and techniques. But Henry still kept his father's old toolbox in the barn, still approached broken machinery with the same philosophy that had served him over Nazi Germany. Understand the principle, adapt to circumstances, and make do with what you have. He never talked much about the war. When other veterans gathered to share stories, Henry usually listened more than he spoke. But on one occasion, at a county fair in the summer of 1953, a young mechanic, struggling with a broken combine, asked Henry for advice. The part they needed wouldn't arrive for 3 days, and the weather forecast called for rain that would ruin the unharvested wheat. Henry looked at the broken component, looked at the materials available, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of gum. The young mechanic stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Henry just smiled and said, "Let me show you something my father taught me about making things work when they shouldn't." An hour later, the combine was running again, powered by a repair that no factory technician would approve, but that would hold long enough to save the harvest. As the machine rolled back into the field, the young mechanic shook his head in amazement. "Where'd you learn to fix things like that?" Henry looked up at the clear Iowa sky, remembered a different sky filled with flak and fighters and impossible odds, remembered 8 men who'd trusted him to find a way when there shouldn't have been one. "My father's farm," he said, "and in a bomber over Germany, when I didn't have any choice but to figure it out." The young mechanic didn't understand, but that was all right. Some lessons could only be learned through necessity, through moments when the rulebook didn't have answers, and you had to write your own. Henry had learned that lesson in an Iowa cornfield, and proven it at 30,000 feet over enemy territory. The specific circumstances changed, but the principle remained constant. When faced with an impossible problem, sometimes the solution wasn't elegant or by the book or even fully rational. Sometimes it was just whatever worked, held together with skill and improvisation and maybe a little bit of gum. Years later, aviation historians would study the engineering reports from Henry's repair and struggle to fully explain how it functioned. The mathematics didn't quite work, the safety margins were non-existent, and the whole arrangement seemed to defy several principles of mechanical engineering. But the records were clear. 8 men had climbed out of that bomber alive when they should have been dead or captured, all because a farmer's son remembered how his father thought about broken machines. The official Army Air Force's commendation that Henry received mentioned his technical skill, his quick thinking under pressure, and his dedication to his crew. But it didn't mention the real lesson, the one his father had taught him in a dust-choked Iowa field when times were desperate and solutions had to come from nowhere. Sometimes survival wasn't about having the right tools or the proper training, or following the established procedures. Sometimes it was about understanding that machines, like people, could be coaxed into doing the impossible if you understood them well enough and cared enough to try. Henry Dobbins passed away in 1998 at the age of 78, surrounded by family on the same farm where he'd learned to fix impossible problems with whatever materials were at hand. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service and his contributions to the community, but it didn't tell the story of how a belt strap, some chewing gum, and a hose clamp had saved 8 lives over Nazi Germany. That story lived on in aviation museums, in veteran reunions, in engineering classrooms, where instructors used it as an example of creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. The wreckage of Prairie Dog was long gone, melted down, and recycled into new aircraft or other war materials. But the principle behind Henry's impossible repair endured. In maintenance hangars and flight schools, in cockpits and workshops, the story was told and retold. The day a farmer's son used Depression-era improvisation to save a dying bomber and prove that sometimes the best solution wasn't in any manual. It was in understanding that when everything else failed, ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to try the crazy idea might be all that stood between life and death. And on that cold March day in 1944, 30,000 feet above enemy territory with nowhere to go but down, crazy had been exactly what they needed.